Welcome everyone to the Hilltop Outreach Institute workshop series. It's so great to have you here on what has turned out to be a beautiful April evening in the Seattle area. My name is Becky Krieger. I'm the outreach coordinator here at Hilltop, and I'm very excited to have a new presenter to our lineup here, but certainly a familiar face and name, I'm sure, to many of you. Our presenter tonight is Jamie Cho. Jamie is a consultant, educator, and scholar who specializes in equity and justice in education. Jamie is also the vice president-elect of the NACCE Governing Board. She's held many titles and roles in her career as an education professional, and Jamie's going to tell you a little bit more about herself in just a moment when the training gets started. So just some housekeeping items to remind you all. If you would like to access closed captioning, you can click on the More button at the bottom of your screen or where you find your Zoom menu bar. Click there, you'll see Turn on Closed Captions, and you can select your language as well. If you can have your camera on, we do appreciate that. It just really helps with our interactions and to make this a conversational training tonight. Totally understand if that's not an option or possible for you, no problem. And just make sure your mute button is turned on unless you would like to ask a question or participate in another way. We would love for you to engage as much as you can tonight. So if you do have a question or you want to make a helpful comment, you can raise your Zoom hand, you can come on camera and put your physical hand up, or you can drop a question in the chat, and I will be helping Jamie monitor that throughout the evening. And lastly, if you are having any tech issues, you can message me directly in the chat. If you get kicked off of Zoom, just email me at institute@hilltopcc.org, and I'll help get you back in the room. And lastly, before I pass things off to Jamie, we want to take a moment to invite you to pause and join us all in grounding ourselves here in this space, in this time. I'm sure you've all had busy days coming off of perhaps a busy day or week, jumping into this training. And we want to take a moment to just come into our bodies and also acknowledge the land that we are all living and working on. So all of us, wherever we are calling in from, we stand on occupied Indigenous lands that continue to be stewarded and cared for by Native Indigenous communities. Where I and the Hilltop community reside in Seattle and King County, we acknowledge the Coast Salish people, the Duwamish, the Suquamish, the Muckleshoot, and the Snoqualmie tribes, as well as the neighboring Puyallup and Tulalip tribes. We also encourage you to consider that beyond your own participation in Indigenous restorative justice efforts in your own community, consider the ways that you can support young children to engage in these actions as well in meaningful and developmentally appropriate ways. Starting with stories and experiences in nature can be a great starting point for this work in early childhood. So I'm going to put a link in the chat to one powerful resource that we've been using at Hilltop recently to connect both children and ourselves to the wisdom and teachings of the local plant life in the Pacific Northwest through an Indigenous lens. And that book is called Plant Teachings for Growing Social Emotional Skills. And you'll find the link to that in the chat. Thank you for taking that moment to come into this space, acknowledge the land we are on, and consider how you can bring this work back to your program and your work with children and families and teachers. And with that, I'm so excited to welcome Jamie to lead tonight's training. Welcome, Jamie.
Thank you so much, Becky, and thank you to Hilltop for hosting this event and Thank you so much, everyone who's here for taking time out of your evening, and I'm sure a busy day to be here today in community. As Becky said, my name is Jamie Cho. I use she, her pronouns. My doctorate is in special education. I started out working with kids on the autism spectrum in early intervention and pursued my doctorate in special education. And since then have mostly worked in teacher education, working with folks who want to be teachers in early childhood education and special education or in the K-12 public schools. And I also show up as a daughter of immigrants. My parents immigrated to this country in the 70s. My dad came here, uh, went to Texas to pursue his doctorate degree in engineering. And so I was born in Texas, and I was the first in my family to be a US citizen. And I am now raising three Asian American kids, all school age, although my oldest will be graduating from high school this year. So it's a really eventful year for us. And, being a parent and being the daughter of immigrants and a sister and an auntie, all of these identities shape the work that I do and the way that I see the world. And so that comes into, why I want to share about this work today. So to
Hey,
make sure
hey,
everyone's,
Jamie.
oh, yeah.
Your slideshow has disappeared.
Oh my goodness, I don't know why that keeps happening because I can see it right here. But I
Yeah.
will, yeah, I'll put it back on right now.
Okay.
And just if you see me looking to the left, it's just because I have another screen and that's where my slides are. Is it showing now?
Yeah, that looks great. Thanks so
Okay,
much.
great. So I also like to start with a land acknowledgement, and I will keep it short since Becky already did a really nice acknowledgement. But I just want to acknowledge that Indigenous peoples have been caretakers of the land, air, and water since time immemorial and still continue to be at the forefront of advocating for more just policies and practices. And it's our work to learn from and center Indigenous wisdom in our relationships with each other and with children and with our earth. And I think part of what I would like to share today is thinking about these relationships and deepening them in our work with children to really partner and create collective action and movement towards justice. And I also know that these acknowledgements can be performative. And so it really is about how we all engage in action and take those, what we learn and that knowledge into our daily practices to honor Indigenous sovereignty and to advocate for justice. And I also like to acknowledge that Black Lives Matter. I'll read a quote from Cornel West, and it says, "The country is in deep trouble. We've forgotten that a rich life consists fundamentally of serving others, trying to leave the world a little better than you found it. We need the courage to question the powers that be, the courage to be impatient with evil and patient with people, the courage to fight for social justice. In many instances, we will be stepping out on nothing and just hoping to land on something. And that's the struggle. To live is to wrestle with despair, yet never allow despair to have the last word." And I just think that's really powerful and really about the work that we need to do in early childhood education to ensure that all children walk freely in this world. And we know that it took hundreds of years to be in the place that we are now, and it may take hundreds more years to see a more just system or world. And I'm I hope that we are all in that struggle together. All right. And just to get us started, and I like to start with brave space, and that we know that most spaces that we come into cannot be entirely safe for all of us, depending on our identities and our lived experiences and things. So I like to offer these proposed community agreements for us as we're engaged in conversation today. One, speak your truth. Would love to have engagement. Folks share out and participate in breakout rooms later towards the end. So I ask that you speak your truth and use I statements when telling your stories or talking about observations, and rather than generalizing to all people or to all children, etc. Do what you need to do to stay engaged. I know it's beautiful outside. You might need a stretch having just come home, or you need to have something to eat. So please do whatever you need to do to be here, and please take care of your needs. What's said here stays here, confidentiality. So, when you go into your breakout rooms, if people share something personal about their experience or their own stories, just ask that you keep that confidential unless you ask for permission to share it outside or to someone else. But what's learned here leaves here. So please take your takeaways, what you learned from those stories, and take it out and have discussions with other people, because the purpose of our learning is to engage in actions that will support it in broader spaces with children, with families, with our communities. So please, yeah, take those things and discuss with others. And then assume positive intent and assume responsibility for impact. So I think when we come into a space where we're trying to learn and we're curious, we all assume that everyone here has only positive intentions. But sometimes when we're curious and asking questions, that curiosity can lead to an impact that was unintended and cause someone to be offended or harm someone. And so I just ask that if that happens, please assume some responsibility for that impact and apologize or make amends. And then finally, expect non-closure and messiness. In 2 hours, we can talk as much as we want, and sometimes we'll leave with more questions than answers. And I always think that's a great place to be, because when we're curious and asking questions, we're going to look for some more answers and think more and talk more with folks and do our own research and things. So um, unfortunately, I may not be able to give you all the answers, and fortunately, that means that these questions may lead you to have more conversations and dig a little bit deeper. So I hope that is the case. And also, I'm pretty casual presenter, so if you have questions throughout this time together, feel free to use the chat or unmute or raise your hand. I can't necessarily see everyone all at once, so if you're gesturing and I can't see you, please unmute or signal to Becky or me, and I will be happy to answer your questions or your comments as we go along. Are there any questions about these community agreements, or anything that you feel is missing or needs to be added? And I always just pause for a minute to allow people to process and decide if they want to answer. It's never meant as any kind of pressure to folks to speak up. I just want to honor that we all have different processing speeds, and sometimes a little bit of time can generate thoughts and ideas. All right. I also really like to start with a mindfulness moment, which originates from Hindu and Buddhist cultures. So, if you feel safe and comfortable, I'll invite you to close your eyes or lower your gaze, and feel free to go off camera if you like. And we're just going to take 3 deep breaths together to ground us in this time together and in the here and now, in the present. So, if you want to close your eyes or lower your gaze, I'll invite you to take a deep inhale through your nose, feeling your belly rise, and then release that breath slowly through your mouth. I'll invite you to take a second deep breath in through your nose, feeling your belly rise, and then release that breath through your mouth. And one last deep, deep inhale through your nose. And then release that breath slowly through your mouth. When you're ready, I'll invite you to come back into this space. Thank you so much for doing that. I always find slows me down for sure. I'm like, go, go, go. And I just need a moment to pause and remember that there's abundance in community and to be reminded to be in the here and now. All right, so first I'm going to talk about a court case, and this is an anti-harassment court case, and it's ongoing. So it is very real, very present, um, and is happening in Washington State. So I'd like to introduce you to Zen. I've had the honor to know her as a community advocate, and she's become a friend to me, even though I did not know her in the beginning when I first met her. She identifies as a 67-year-old Asian American immigrant woman. She moved here from China over 25 years ago, and she works as a part-time school bus driver for a local school district. And she also cares for her uncle, um, who is legally blind. And she is such a really just a lovely person. And she lives in Washington State in our region. And she has for many, many years. She also is multilingual. She speaks, 3 languages fluently, but English is not one that is a fluent language for her. She would say that she has limited English. And I'd say a handful of years ago, she bought a condo with a little bit of a water view, and this is where she planned to retire. But shortly after moving into this condo, she found that she lived next door to a white woman who was racist, and this woman began to harass her. So, perceiving Zen as weak and as an immigrant with limited English, and because she had this racial animus toward Asian Americans, she engaged in a campaign of harassment against Zen and another Asian American neighbor in the same condo complex. And at the time, I'm going to call the harasser A, was also engaged to a police officer who had used racial slurs against Zen and was terminated from his job because of that in 2024. And that was really public news. It was in the local newspapers, and the the mayor and the police chief made a public statement about it. So a lot of what I'm sharing with you is public records. And if you were to Google or to look up court documents, you'd be able to find it. And as I said, I've come to know Zen as a community advocate and supporting her in interpretation and translation. I speak Mandarin, and now as a friend. And in fact, a year and a half ago or something, there was a film made about Zen, and you can find it on Amazon Prime as part of the AAPI Heritage Heroes series. It's in the most recent season, and it's called Yuan Fen, which means fate. And so when I was talking about the racialized harassment, it included all of these things. It included racial slurs being directed at her, profanity, insults regularly. Um, it included, at the time, A served as the president of their HOA or homeowners association, and there had been a leak in the ceiling of Zen's condo, and she refused to make the necessary repairs. There was threats of jail and calling of the police, including with her fiance or partner who was making those threats. And there's also been a weaponizing of the legal systems where She has gone to court probably over 40 times in the past 4 years. And a lot of that has been to defend herself against submitting, documents to the court alleging that she's the victim of harassment when it was the other way around. And just so we know, because most of us don't know this about the law, is that unlawful harassment is defined as knowing and willful course of conduct directed at a specific person which seriously alarms, annoys, harasses, or is detrimental to such person, and which serves no legitimate or lawful purpose. And the course of conduct shall be such as would cause a reasonable person to suffer substantial emotional distress and shall actually cause substantial emotional distress to the petitioner, or when the course of conduct would cause a reasonable parent to fear for the well-being of their child. So key parts of the definition by law is that it alarms, annoys, harasses, or is detrimental to a person's well-being or causes emotional distress. And also that would be reasonable, it would cause a reasonable person to feel emotional distress. And so you can see all of these things fall under that category. And unlawful harassment can be one really frightening, threatening event, or it can be an ongoing, repetitive course of conduct. So after about 3 years of advocating in courts and having this ongoing harassment happened last year, a little over a year, Zen was able to get a 10-year protection order against A. And that's pretty remarkable because courts don't generally give such long-term protection orders. She first had a 1-year protection order, and because the harassment continued, then she was able to get a 10-year protection order. But even though, and it felt like such a victory to get a 10-year protection order because it's almost as permanent as one can get. But in fact, after the 10-year protection order, A installed additional ring cameras directed at Zen's condo. There's 5. And despite the fact that the protection order had prohibited her from recording Zen in the first place. And the 10-year protection order also required that A resign as board president of the HOA, but she did not resign until the attorney had to get involved to remove her from the board in accordance with that court ruling. And so even though protection order is in place and a pretty substantial one at that, it hasn't actually protected her from the ongoing harassment. And part of that is because they're neighbors, they live within 10 feet from each other, and the court does not go far enough to ensure that that protection is meaningful and enforceable. So, so in court, we've told the judge that this is not enough because when we call the police, like they don't see the racial animus and they don't document it, and the court just gives the accountability to the police to enforce, and then the police show up and they say, well, the court didn't do X, Y, or Z, and so nobody is actually holding that protection as something to be held accountable to. And even people in the community, like in the HOA, this is a very small condo unit, so there's 3 board of directors, and they refuse to get involved despite the court ruling. They still want to feel like they're neutral and not take sides, but when the overwhelming evidence is that there has been this ongoing harassment going on, then that doesn't feel like neutrality anymore. It feels like an absence of accountability. Um, so in all of these court cases and going to court so many times, which is draining on both financial resources and time and energy, and also just feels awful even when you do win a tenure protection order, because you have to rehash all of the things that are happening and you have to hear from the opposing side their lies about you in court. And for Zen in particular, she also has to rely on an interpreter giving her an accurate account of what is being said. And that's been a real issue and big problem in these court cases. So in almost every court hearing, the interpretation has either been non-existent, interrupted, or erroneous. And as I said before, we've been to court in over 15 court cases where she's had to defend herself from these false allegations from her neighbor, where A claims to be scared or fear for her life even. Interpretation has been cut short or inadequate or absent. And even it feels like, and it's true, that Zen's freedom depends on her access to due process and understanding what's going on so that she can respond in a meaningful way. The court has not gone to the length necessary to ensure her rights were protected. So for instance, in Superior Court last year, when the harasser falsely alleged that Zen was stalking her, because one of the ways that Zen has been able to protect herself is to wear a body camera or to use her cell phone when they are in vicinity of each other. A took that to court to say that she was stalking her. And in this court hearing, there was a simultaneous interpretation going on. So that means Zen had to wear headphones, and somebody was interpreting while the judge or whoever was talking at the same time, which is very, very difficult to do. And it's extra difficult to do in Mandarin. And usually in the past court cases, they have been continuous. So I would say something in English and then it would be interpreted in Mandarin and vice versa. But when Zen's attorney asked the judge to record the Mandarin interpretation, since there have been so many issues in the past, the judge noted that the Mandarin track would not be part of the record and launched into this really condescending explanation that court interpreters were certified, as if we didn't know that, and that and to circumvent any discussion about how to document if there were errors, because that's a way that it could be appealed. And there was one point in this case where the interpreter was not interpreting at all, and Zen was not hearing what was going on at all. And so I'm going to play a little audio of court, and you will hear that the interpreter is having a very hard time interpreting. I do want to caution you all that you will hear the aggressor, the harasser's voice in this audio. And for me, I feel like it's very upsetting, the things she says. So just want to let you know that before I play it, but it's a very short clip.
And I do want to add, walking out with my dog, there was a black unmarked car the other day, and go ahead, interpreter.
I don't quite get it, what she was just said again.
She said that when she went out of her house to walk her dog, there was an unmarked black car in front of her house the other day.
哦，那天我出去带狗出去散步的时候，有一个车子黑颜色的在门口停在那边。
And all I could think of was that window rolling down and shooting me, as the Chinese organization is now involved in this matter, and I don't know why. In my restraining order, they're trying to take it away.
You're speaking too fast, too long. The sentence. There's no way I can interpret it for you.
Yes, Your Honor. The Chinese Information Service Center has been sending me things.
中国那些知识文件，这一些东西给我嘛，
They are trying to interfere with my protective order.
来想处置我的保护令，妨碍我的保护令。
Mia New, that's on the call here, defamed me in front of Kenmore City Council.
来在这回
Okay, I was going to stop there, but you can see this is not from the court case that I just talked about where it was absent, but this is another example of being in court where it was continuous, so they're one-to-one interpretation, but the interpreter was having a really hard time interpreting what was being said. And so you can imagine that if you're on the receiving end of that, you're not getting anything of what is being said because you don't understand the English that was said, and then the interpreter didn't interpret anything and then just spoke in English again to say that they couldn't interpret it. And you can hear her making wild accusations about a Chinese organization being involved, and what she's referring to is the Chinese Information and Service Center, which is a social service agency for immigrants who have been involved to support Zen with interpretation and translation, and with some, like a little bit of costs, but mostly support for her to navigate the systems that she's now being involved in. But in that Superior Court case where there was absent interpretation, the judge went on the record to say that the interpretation was admirable at the end of the court hearing, even though, one, he could not hear the interpretation, and two, he did not understand Mandarin, and three, it was actually not admirable because it was non-existent. And so right now that case is being appealed on this fact that interpretation was not happening, and that violates her due process and her ability to engage in defending herself. And as a community advocate, I have written declarations to the court to show how racism is not only about the blatant racial slurs, but the wielding of power over other people, and how that persistent harassment has been directed at Zen. And I've written many op-eds to illustrate what I see are these really uneven power dynamics happening within our judicial system, with the judges not seeing the racial animus or the uneven power distribution, and perceiving this as an interpersonal conflict or a neighborly dispute, when it goes much, much deeper than that, when we recognize the racism and the xenophobia that's showing up in the interactions. And also, the police, when they've been called to enforce the protection order, have done nothing. And in most cases, when a couple of times I have rushed there to be with her when the police have been called because of interpretation and language issues, that they have been really condescending. And there was even one police officer who at one point said that he's an immigrant too, and he learned English, implying that she should learn better English to be protected by police and the court system. And so you can see how all these people who probably are good people and do good work in their communities and have families, they are still reinforcing the racism within the system. And I think people also don't want to admit that they're racist, including A. In multiple court documents, she has objected to the idea of being a racist, and yet she has not curbed her behavior at all. And she's also brought so-called friends to court who identified as Asian to show that she's not racist. She's hired an Asian attorney at one point to show that she's not a racist. And she's had multiple people submit declarations to the court saying that they're Asian and they're friends with her, and thus she couldn't be racist. And as I said before, with the HOA too, there's a new president that took that position, and after years of seeing this ongoing, the HOA president has not intervened and has even said something like, "If I see discrimination, I will say something." So there's just this real absence of seeing the real dynamics happening here, and trying to stay out of it or protect their own interests in some way to not be involved. And to that point, I want to also share that it's because of this really strong group of community advocates, multiple pro bono attorneys, and the support of the Chinese Information and Service Center that Zen has been able to take this on. She's endured years of abuse, and the law does very little to remedy that. And it also comes with exorbitant personal cost with legal fees, including, filing documents with the court or getting audio recordings and taking time away from work that could be spent on other things. And also just the energy and emotional toll to be constantly on the lookout of what might happen next when you have someone who's so unpredictable living next door to you. And all this is compounded by having limited English and having to navigate a system that is, at best unfriendly to those who do not have a command of English and dominant American norms. But through it all, this difficulty and all this injustice, I have felt very fortunate to come to know and call these people friends, folks who don't retire from a fight against oppression, who are relentless in their advocacy, and who cheer each other on with each small victory, even though the system continues to be inequitable. And it's been a really empowering experience to know that there are people in this world who, with no benefit to themselves, have stood in solidarity, spent their own time, money, effort, and have taken this on as if Zen were their sister and relative, in ways that we don't often see folks do in rallying for others. And so I just want to draw this distinction between a friend and a co-conspirator. I was just in classrooms this week, and I know we often use this word friends when we describe children in a classroom or a classroom community, or we might call so-and-so my friend. And so I looked up a definition, and that's a person whom we know and with whom one has a bond of mutual affection. So a friend is really just someone that you feel good about and that you like, and maybe want to share time with. And in my experience through this case, I just feel like we need co-conspirators, not just friends. We need a person who's going to recognize their privilege and take actions against oppression alongside those who are directly impacted by it, even when it's unpopular to do so. So I feel like we need to change that term that we use with children. Like, why foster them to be friends? Let's foster them to be co-conspirators, to be activists, to be agitators in the name of justice, and to build a community that is really energized by that and committed to doing that work. And so I just wanted to raise those two ideas. And also related to the case too, and this group of folks who have been advocating on behalf of Zen, is that it has that as a community advocate working on this case, mostly behind the scenes, now I have been targeted by this harasser. So she targeted my work at a university and made unfounded claims to bunch of people, the university, so much so that they issued a cease and desist order to her to stop calling and contacting the university. So now I got a 10-year protection order against her in September, but now it is under appeal. So now I am paying thousands of dollars to an attorney to defend my protection order because I've been an advocate on a case for somebody who didn't speak English and who needed people on her side. So our legal system has a lot of different it upholds oppression and injustice, and it was not intentionally designed to serve everybody equally or equitably. And that is how our system has been created. And so I want to, we're going to switch gears in a moment here, but I want to take all of these parts of this case, which I think has so many teachable moments in it. And that's partly why I've written so many op-eds about it, is that every time we go to court or every time something happens, I notice how it upholds the racism, xenophobia, and oppression that we see in our system. And these people, these actors in those scenarios could make a different choice that would make a huge difference. But every time without fail, it's almost been like they don't. And I think that raising awareness about this is like one of the first things that we can do to make systems change and to create a system that is equitable for us and just for children. Um, and so in a minute, I'm going to switch gears to make this analogous to early childhood education. But before we do that, I just want to take a moment for you to think about, these dynamics that we're seeing in the world, or in this case in particular, they didn't come out of nowhere, right? These adults were all children at one point. They had families, they had teachers, they went to school, they had a community, they had neighbors, and they all grew up to be people who hold some privilege and power in this world. And what's been so disappointing to me in seeing this, even though I know that systems are designed to be inequitable and racism exists, et cetera, is that at every turn, these people are making choices to not stand up against racism, to not advocate for what is just and right, and to put their personal interests in front of the collective, or instead of the victims in this case. And so I want to just take a moment to think about how that shows up in early childhood education, in the building of our communities, in the socialization of children into the norms of American culture, or whiteness, if you will. But I think that might be a good pausing point right now, Becky, for a 5-minute break for folks to stretch and do a bio break or get a drink of water, whatever you need, if that's okay, Becky.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks so much, Jamie. How about we come back at 6:53?
All right. I'm wondering if anybody has any questions or anything at this point before I go to the next slide. Let me check the chat. Oh, yes, I can put the Prime series. I think it's in my slide. So I'm going to do that at the end. Please remind me because I have the link. Oh, well, actually, Becky found it. Thank you, Becky. Still playing catch up. All right. Everyone back, and does anybody have any questions or comments at this point? Okay, let's move forward then. All right, I'm sure you all are familiar and aware of the anti-bias goals, and I'm just going to do a quick overview on them just so that we're on the same page. So we're talking about anti-bias education, which was originally conceptualized by Louise Derman Sparks and Julie Olson Edwards a couple decades ago. It has 4 goals. They are identity, diversity, justice, and action. And when we're talking about identity, it refers to guiding children to be able to think about and have the words to describe people, how people are the same or how they're different. And it's about supporting children to be proud of who they are and to without any superiority and accurate language to describe what that means about their identity. Diversity is about guiding children to think about and have words for how people are different, to value all of the um, different ways that we show up and are part of our identities, or recognizing different cultures or languages, lived experiences is all part of that diversity piece. And then justice is about recognizing unfairness and having the words to talk about it and think about it critically. And then action, finally, which should always be paired with justice, is to support children to have the tools to stand up against unfairness and hurtful language or biases or any thing that has to do with social identity. So really, being an advocate is part of this action piece, taking action against unfairness. So that's why the um, last two goals are usually tied together, because children can often feel dejected if we only talk about the unfair things in the world and not have any action that addresses them. So those are the four identities, and we see them often in schools. Identity. I love seeing all the self-portraits we see often in the beginning of the school year that really looks at, how children look and recognizing their facial features and their skin colors. And diversity often is all the like family photos that we see in the classroom, or the diverse range of books that we read to children, or the songs that we play to showcase all different cultures and identities that serve as a window into other people's experiences. Um, and then justice in action, we see that in all sorts of things, in the way that children stand up for one another on the playground, right? Like something's not fair. Or we know that, if you give one child, 3 goldfish and the other child 10 goldfish, they're going to make a comment around that, right? Because they can recognize that's unfair. And speaking up for themselves is that action to address what they saw as unfair. And so we know that children have this innate capacity to do this. And so part of anti-bias education is just to nurture those capabilities. Is not even necessarily teaching them. It's just fostering and supporting what they already often know. So along those lines, I want to call attention to around this identity um, goal that I don't think we address as much as part of this goal. And that's the piece about without superiority. So do we in early childhood educations disrupt the superiority of white children or children with particular privilege who think that's normalized or just the way things are when they're commenting on things or that come up in their worldview? So I give you an example of that is just recently I was in a classroom and they were doing skin color mixing, like in those identity portraits that we talked about. And children were sitting around a table doing that and mixing their paint. And a white child makes a comment about the child with brown skin being brown. And he makes that comment multiple times in this group setting. And I think generally we in anti-bias education, one, we encourage that, right? We want to talk about difference and we want to make it okay to notice that. And I think what's missed is that there's a nuance there when a white child keeps making that same comment about a brown child, that is then supposing that his superiority or that his white skin color is better or more common or superior to the brown skin. And so making that comment uh, is a distribution of power that is uneven, because then that brown child is being singled out in that moment. is feeling othered in that moment, not sure how to respond, maybe uncomfortable. Even if the child is not uncomfortable, maybe they walk away or they brush it off or they don't think about it. Is that not also the experience that brown people face in this world, to always be commenting on their skin color, their race, their ethnicity, their hair, etc.? So, in that moment, is there an opportunity to not only address the comment about skin color, but interrupt the superiority that comes along with it? And I'll make the connection to the court case in that I think that part of the issue around the harassment is this feeling of superiority and entitlement. And I think, for A, even though she takes it to an extreme, she's received messages all her life that she can act how she acts and that she's not going to be held accountable. People are not going to, say she's wrong or bad or racist. And so she's been able to dictate and behave in a way that has been uninterrupted. And so when I think about the court case, I often, and because of background in early childhood, I think what could we do in early childhood to ensure that this never happens again to somebody in a system who doesn't have to deal with these racist behaviors, who doesn't get dragged to court because of someone's animus toward them, and to not have judges who can't recognize the racism or who don't recognize that there are power imbalances. And I think this is all things that we're taught in our socialization as young children and continuing for ages through our adulthood, that we privilege some people and we don't privilege others. And I think sometimes not interrupting the superiority is not about the children, it's about us as adults and how uncomfortable it makes us feel to make a comment around the power piece of skin and race. Because when we talk about skin color, that's not actually talking about race. Skin color is a proxy for race, right? We've used skin color as a way to say someone's racialized or not racialized. But when we only talk about it at a color level, we're only talking about color. But when we bring it to talking about race and racism, then we're talking about the power imbalance that is associated with the color of our skin. And so in this identity piece, I think in anti-bias education, we can do a little bit more to dig a little bit deeper around interrupting the superiority that comes so naturally and feels a norm in and particularly white children, although not only white children. And that's the sense of entitlement. So, like, I think that's a something to navigate too, right? We want everyone to feel proud of who they are, but we don't want them to feel superior to others. And so we must think about how identities are all being celebrated and honored, but that superiority is not part of that. And I think there's a myth in early childhood that classrooms are not political or that children are too innocent. And yet we see this reproduction of status quo within classrooms all the time. Whose voice is being heard? Whose identity is being privileged? Who's even thinking about that language piece too. We often have English dominant classrooms unless you're an immersive classroom. And so how are children who are still learning English or multilingual made to feel like they don't have a space there, or their voice is not being heard in the same way that others are feeling? And yeah, and I guess related also to the case is that many times A has called the police because she thought things like spitting is aggressive, and she felt entitled to call the police over 20 times in this case, saying things like she was scared for her life or crying hysterically when really nothing happened. And so I think that's a real sense of entitlement that she is owed access to all law enforcement, and they need to come at her beck and call because of, a little thing that she thinks is, and I'm not even sure that she really thinks it's scary, but she catastrophizes it in a way to get the attention of authorities to perpetuate her harassment. And so you can see this is an extreme example of someone who feels entitled to resources and to other people's time and energy and sympathy or empathy. And I think this is something that we need to think about more in early childhood, as how are we addressing that earlier on so that it does not become so extreme. Um, and then diversity, as we were talking about, is really about guiding children to think about and have words for how people are the same and different. And I think there's an interesting way that the word different is used, because I think sometimes it can be coded language when we say, so and so is different, or this food is different, or that culture is different, or it felt different to be somewhere, meaning carrying a connotation of othering or inferior or not normal or strange or weird, if you will. So I want to be careful about how we're using this term different and how we're comparing what's the same and what's different. So, an example is that in a classroom, you might not ask a teacher might not ask the child who doesn't speak English to share because they don't have a shared language in that classroom, and it might be explained that they know a different language or they speak a different language at home. And on the surface level, that's a valid explanation, right? It just shows that we have other languages. But when it's normalized to be English only, and we don't actually utilize multilingualism in a classroom or in a workplace or in other spaces, then it becomes, wow, from a deficit, it becomes a deficit model or perspective, right? That they're so different that they can't be involved in our activity right now, is the message that is being received, not only by the child who now cannot engage, but the other children in the classroom that are seeing somebody else not being able to participate. And I think that also comes in like with all the what I shared about the case around the language access, because the court systems, despite the rule being making sure that folks have access to interpretation, the rule on itself is not really actually ensuring adequate access to interpretation. Um, so just giving an interpreter who may not be able to interpret well or interpret thoroughly is our idea of access to justice, even though it's essentially not. And it made a big difference in the case. So there was an example of there's been multiple examples, but one example was that the the harasser A in court said, "I'm no longer engaged," to the police officer fiance. And it got interpreted to say, "We're not talking anymore." Because engaged in American like colloquialism, when someone says engaged, that means you're engaged to be married. But engaged as a word on its own, if you don't understand that, is just like talking to each other or interacting. And so that's what Zen received. And she felt like that was wrong because she had still seen them together. Um, and so these nuances in language, they're very complicated, especially when you're interpreting and there's these high stakes, it's a high stakes consequences. And when there are mistakes that way, they can have real repercussions for people. So that difference is not really honored or validated or supported. It's just like a surface level accommodation being made to folks to have an interpreter without insurance that it's actually going to make sure that they have um, access to due process and that their words are going to be heard and interpreted correctly, or that they're hearing everything that they need to hear to participate in their defense. Okay, and then with justice is again about building children's innate budding capacities for empathy and fairness and to think critically. And I think one thing I want to think about around this is again thinking back to those power dynamics that happen in all personal relationships and in all systems. And so within the classroom, this example of a teacher who was using a Black persona doll and while telling the story about the Black persona doll was repeatedly touching the Black persona doll's hair, which we know is a common microaggression that happens to Black folks. And my question really is thinking about like, how do we give opportunities for children to interrupt that dynamic? Because if we think about the power dynamics in the classroom, the teacher holds the power both as an adult, as someone who has authority, who can make decisions about, disciplinary actions, and who has the ability to, change a routine for a child in that space. So if we think about it in a power imbalance method of a classroom, then where are we supporting children to engage in disrupting unfairness, even at that level? Because I think that's really, really hard. And I don't think that we really want children to question us in that way. But if we really are supportive or wanting to engage in justice and action, then we have to be okay also with distributing power in a more even space. Because I think one of the issues around working towards justice and social justice is like most of us have never felt a space, like been part of a space that's truly just and truly equitable. And part of like being able to enact that, and I think about this a lot with teacher education, is to create a space where we feel it, because then we can build it. It's like different than theoretically understanding, what justice or equity feels is, and then trying to build it versus feeling what it felt like to be in such a space and then creating it. And I think in early childhood, it is completely possible to create communities and spaces that have disrupted power dynamics so that children can feel what it feels like to have the power to interrupt someone who has more power than them, but be received receptively and with compassion and care and without defensiveness, and be able to have a conversation about it. And I just elevate this example as one moment where if we are talking to children about race and racism and microaggressions and things, that they might be able to say like, hey, I noticed that you were touching so and so's hair, and I don't think they would like that, or whatever there is, to interrupt that and for that to be received as a powerful learning experience coming from a child. And I think that this would be be revolutionary to our systems, because part of the court system problem with the court system is that judges have failed to recognize the imbalance in power, and they've not seen it as systemic, but they've seen it as interpersonal. So when you think of it as interpersonal, you just see two disputing neighbors or two people who don't agree, rather than seeing all the history behind why one person has more privilege and power than the other. But rather than, and even after not recognizing that, so many judges have like sort of dug in their heels to prove that they, didn't do anything wrong. And you can see that in that example of saying that the interpretation was admirable, because clearly it is not. But to defend their position and to not be overturned on appeal, they had to say that for the record to preserve it and to maintain their integrity in that space. And so you can see that there's this um, real desire for personal gain and to defend our own, reputation or whatever it is, rather than stepping back and seeing the picture as a whole and recognizing that for us to make systems change, sometimes we're going to be wrong, and maybe correcting ourselves in that is the greater good in a sense. And I think in early childhood, when we're working with children, and sometimes it feels like there's not that many rules because we're, focused on play or creativity, it kind of obscures the way that whiteness is present in all the decisions and the practices that are happening in the field. And in that sense, there actually are more power dynamics within the classroom than what we're seeing in the court, because the court actually has all these rules written out. You can feel the authoritarian nature of court, right? You stand up when the judge comes in, you sit down when they give you permission to. Attorneys have to ask for permission to leave a case. Like everything requires permission from the court to do anything. And it's all written out. It's all there for you to know how authoritarian it is. And in early childhood, we don't ever acknowledge that there is any authoritarian pieces to it, or that we're intentionally upholding whiteness. So that invisibility is actually can be more dangerous because we can unintentionally cross that boundary that was unclear in the first place. And so, in this goal where we want to foster children's understanding of unfairness and fairness, and to really think critically about the issues that go beyond what they experience themselves, right? And that might not be something that they experience themselves. I think we need to look at these different forms of unfairness within not just individuals, but also engage in like systems thinking. And I think there's lots of stereotypes about how young children are innocent or egocentric and that they can't think more expansively or beyond what they've only experienced themselves. And I think that's very not true. We see that with the way that they engage in nature, right? Like they can think about through this lens of empathy about how bugs and insects are engaging with the world, or how the plants and the trees are growing or not growing, and what they're experiencing in the world. And so I don't think that that's true, that children are entirely egocentric in that way, but it is our responsibility as adults to foster that thinking and grow that connection to people who they don't know. And I think that's the job of justice, is that we have to disrupt the individualism and the way we think only about our local communities, because ultimately that's a fallacy. Things that we do affect people halfway around the world. And we see that with our increasing technology around AI and climate justice and things that we are, particularly us in one of the richest nations in the world, right, do have an impact, particularly on the global south and those who are experiencing much more injustice as a result of our overutilization of resources. And so how can we, this are really thinking about how we can challenge children to recognize that unfairness and be able to challenge those power dynamics within the classroom and in other spaces. And then finally, with action, we're talking about giving children the tools for learning how to stand up to hurtful and unfair biased behavior based on any aspect of social identity. And so here is taking that understanding of unfairness to an action that disrupts it and that engages in discussions, or that fosters, I think, also like a dreaming of a world that is more just, because I think none of us know what a truly just world is. We haven't experienced that. So that engages, there has to be a creative aspect to that when we're taking action. Um, there's no one right way, and it involves an imagination of sorts to think of, dream of, imagine, and create a world that is more just. And that's the work of action. So, related to the story about skin color mixing and the comments in the first example, here's another example is that when I was in a classroom and a child was looking at the self-portraits on the wall, and a white child looked at one of the self-portraits with brown skin or brown paint and said, that one is a mistake. It's wrong. It shouldn't be that color. And the teacher said, well, no, actually, that is their skin color. It's this, brown color. And two kids of color spoke up and said, yeah, we know that, we know that child and their skin is brown. And they, validated and they talked about it. And they, in essence, did this action, right? Stand up for the person that they knew and said that that is their skin color. It is brown. And that's a beautiful example of action and totally within the realm of what children can do. And as I stepped back and thought about this more, I also thought about how painful it is to witness that brown children are the ones that have to step up in this moment. Because then I'm thinking about racial battle fatigue, right? When we see microaggressions, when we see racism, when we see xenophobia, when we see any of these isms, often it falls to the community that's already been marginalized to disrupt it, to interrupt it, to create change, and to upset that status quo. And so, in thinking about action, I also just want to complicate it in thinking about who is the one that's taking action when we're seeing these forms of unfairness and injustice. And what does it mean as teachers to support the white kids to be the ones that interrupt the racism and have the brown and black kids take a step back because they don't have to, because they're in a community where people recognize it and have the words to advocate against it without making anybody feel bad in their childlike way. But it just made me feel like, why is this a burden already on 3 and 4-year-olds that they have to take on for the rest of their lives? And even if they didn't feel like it was a burden in this moment, I imagine, 30, 40 years later, after all of these microaggressions and insults and systemic things happening, that you just like, this is the larger unfairness, right? Like the interpersonal unfairness. Yeah, that was unfair. I'm so glad you took a action. Yes, we should applaud the children for doing that. And when we step back and see that it's systemic, how are we encouraging this us to address that systemic piece, not just from the children's point of view, but from our teacher, our administrator, our school experience, that what is taught or supported is not meant to be equal. It needs to be equitable, right? So not everyone needs to get the same lessons about interrupting racism, because while, white kids are privileged enough to not experience it or not have to talk about it, Black and brown kids are experiencing it every single day and have the name and the words and the feelings for it. So when it happens at school, yet another place where they were meant to be safe and protected and supported to have fun, etc., can it not be their burden to be the one to take action? And I think, you know, going back to that case, it's been really painful to witness how many good people have done nothing and think that they're being neutral. And in all these interactions with systems, we've seen how these decent people have failed to act according to their values that they espouse. And they've granted exceptions to A while failing to support Zen. And they've treated anti-Asian hate as an interpersonal conflict, a neighborly dispute. These words all undermine that underlying racial animus that's not just a conflict, because conflict implies that there are two equal sides and perspectives when the weight of racism is not the same. And probably the most disappointing thing is how people of color have sided with the racist white neighbor woman. At least 3 women of color signed declarations stating that they're friends with A and that she could not be a racist because they wouldn't be friends with her if she was. And there have been multiple men of color who have refused to acknowledge the racism, including that police officer that I told you about earlier. And so I just think that it's not just about the children in the scenario, but also all the bystanders that are in that classroom, right? Even if they're not the one being talked about or they're not the ones that are standing up, how do we invite them in to be co-conspirators like we talked about? We aren't really truly friends, or friends is not really the word if you're not willing to be a co-conspirator in these moments, and particularly in the hardest moments. It's easy to be a co-conspirator in the most superficial sense if you don't have to give up anything, if you're not going to be harmed in any way, if you get to just walk away. Um, so I think it's very difficult to be an advocate in many ways, especially because our system is so inequitably designed, and you in my own experience too, you become the target of it, or blamed, or scapegoated for your advocacy to change systems. And this is what we need to build a just future. And we need folks who are going to step up and be part of that community, to both calling people in and leading the charge and creating opportunities for everyone to see just how unjust the system is. So really want to think about, as we're moving through these goals, is that each one of them, I think we can trouble a little bit to think a little bit more deeply about how we agitate toward justice and not just anti-bias. I think there's a little bit of a step beyond anti-bias to be anti-racist, anti-oppressive, and that involves, I think, us as adults thinking and criticizing and questioning what we think we're teaching children, because also anti-bias education has been around for decades, and yet we've not seen any change in our social society, right? In fact, right now we're going through very difficult political times, very troubling times, where people are choosing profit over people and choosing power over their values, or what we thought were their values. Um, and so all of our systems, particularly around capitalism too, contribute to this way of thinking and being. Um, and I think we have the power to disrupt that in early childhood education by fostering these kind of different mentality toward our approach into relationships and building community. All right, so I'd love to spend, 10, 15 minutes in breakout rooms so that you can process and think through things I've shared or what you've seen in classrooms around your own experience. And here are just a few questions to get you thinking. How can children be taught to be co-conspirators? How can you support children to think more critically and systemically? And how can you support children's capabilities to disrupt power dynamics? So I'll leave you with those 3 questions. And Becky, if you would put folks in breakout rooms, that'd be great.
You bet. I'll go ahead and get that fired up. Okay. And we'll take about 10 minutes in our breakout rooms. Does that sound good, Jamie?
Sounds great.
All right, we'll see y'all back here soon after you have a chance to chat with your other attendees.
I hope you had a good discussion in your groups. I'd love to take a few moments here if anybody wants to share out any thoughts, comments, questions from your group discussion or anything staying with you in the moment. Use the chat or you're welcome to unmute.
I had the pleasure of being able to join Leanne and Marissa's conversation, and I know they shared some really rich things. I wonder if Leanne and Marissa, would you be willing to share any of the things you discussed?
I can share a little bit. First of all, Jamie, thank you for being here and for sharing this court case because it puts it into perspective, knowing that as early childhood educators, like we have the power to have our kids, be exposed to and disrupt all that from a very young age so that when you are adults, your schemas are not set where you have this one way of thinking and feel this authoritarianism and all of that. So that put everything into perspective for me. And to Marissa as we were going through the questions. And then one thing we were talking about was um, different ways, like for the co-conspirators, ways that we can if we hear something on the playground or anything like that, how we can reenact it with teacher theater or doll stories or anything like that. And then we also talked about, where's Marissa? What else, Marissa?
We have. Oh, I think that we follow up often with the
Yeah,
family. I
yeah.
think that is helpful because maybe we're working with these young kids, but then kind of helping the families to understand what is kind of what we're doing and what it means to be an upstander, bystander, or co-conspirator, and kind of helping them understand what we're teaching the kids at school. And then I think we talked about when we teach the kids how to teach them critically. I think you said it nicely, but just kind of saying, I noticed that like if you see something kind of stewing in a child's mind, but they're not saying it, maybe kind of helping them to feel comfortable enough to kind of say what they're thinking by using the I notice that you're staring at this or whatever it is and kind of talking about it rather than it just staying in their minds. And then supporting the children's capabilities to be, I think I liked what you said. You were just saying, saying that we all make mistakes, kind of, and, admitting our mistakes. And then we were talking about how we make mistakes every day. And for me, with pronouns, with co-teachers or other teachers or with kids on the playground and kind of just admitting that I made a mistake and saying that you're sorry, and so kind of modeling that for the kids so that, and then having a trusting relationship maybe with the teachers, so that it's not so authoritarian, that they feel comfortable enough to kind of say, hey, that's not my pronoun, or that's not whatever it is that is the thing that's not right too. So that's what we talked about.
Thank you both for sharing, and sorry a little bit for putting on you on the spot, but really appreciate your thoughts. And I think, language really does matter in those moments. Like, how are we naming how children are showing up in spaces and what they're thinking, or supporting them to elaborate on that thinking? And I think, you know, these are I think these are nuanced things. It doesn't really mean that we change our practice as a whole. You sort of are doing the same thing that you're doing, but you might just, question something a little bit more because the intention behind it is to move toward this idea of justice, right? And sometimes that idea of justice gets watered down to like empathy or kindness, which are really important skills, and we should foster them, but they're not quite the same as living in a free world. And the way that we articulate that really matters. And I've been thinking a lot about, how we say, like, oh, I know you to be such a kind child, or I know you to be such a brave child. Like, why don't we say, I know you to be an anti-racist child? These are words, and it's not about the jargon, like you can find another word for that, but why do we not put the concept in a child's mind that that's who they are, who they can be? And instead, we fall back on these other things that are very soft that we also want them to be, but it's not like I don't think that's enough. I think we think that we're nice people and we're kind, and there is a way that kindness can change our world, but not if it's not a kindness or a love that's committed to justice. And that's the little bit of a difference that we just need to like pivot a little bit, I think, to get at that. And I really appreciate your thoughts in that pivot toward doing that in the classroom. I want to give the other group space if there's anything they want to share out or any questions or comments that they have.
And Jamie, just a heads up that your slideshow has gone away again.
Yeah,
If you
I thought
want
we could
to,
see
okay,
each other, so I did turn it
perfect,
off, but
perfect. Okay, just wanted to
it's
make
nice
sure
to
you
see
knew.
people's faces when they're talking.
Um, I don't have my camera on, but I can talk a little bit about what we talked about. It was mostly just like experiences that we have had in the classroom. We spent a lot of time where like, we've had children that have made racist comments or,
Mhm.
intentionally or not, and like different situations and how we've handled them. And a lot of I think, you know, we talked about like modeling the behavior and talking about it right then and being accountable and talking to the parents about it. And I think all of these other strategies and things that we've used, but this presentation has really like, at least for me personally, like pushed me further to really want to address kind of what you were talking about with like more like the action and the justice part of it, like and the power dynamics. Like it's never too young to start talking to them about that and be like, how that comment that you just made about that child, like how did that make that child feel and what how it needs to look different and why that's important. And I'm not speaking very eloquently, but I definitely think uh this presentation is making me like think really differently and want to focus more on the action and justice side of when you hear those racist comments be brought up.
Really appreciate you sharing that and your vulnerability and naming it too. And I think this is the work for all of us, right? None of us have it dialed in or know exactly what to do or have been doing this perfectly. That's not really the goal. And we're all always arriving. We're always trying to do better. And I think in teaching children and modeling this, like we all have the capacity to become better human beings too, because we all have our biases and things that we don't recognize in ourselves. And so I think that's a powerful learning tool for us to be around children who may be making these, mistakes or faux pas or showing their biases in ways that catch us in ours. So it's such a gift, I think, that children give to us. All right. I really appreciate you all engaging with the questions and these ideas. And I just want to close out on sort of a positive note. And I think this is Zen's gift to the world is that she has been so brave and courageous in advocating, and not just for herself, but, for her neighbor who was also harassed. And I think, she could have removed herself in some ways from this. To protect herself, but a lot of her advocacy and her bravery has been to ensure that this doesn't happen to anybody else in the future. And so part of that is like raising a lot of awareness and training around this. And this is the first time presenting this to a group of early childhood educators. So I'm so glad it resonated because it wasn't quite sure. And I also talk about it in my classes too, because I think all our systems are connected. So even though sometimes we feel so siloed in our, space with early childhood, these legal cases or other policy cases have implications for how money is distributed, who has power, who's making decisions, et cetera. And so, one thing we're working on right now is legislative change to change the way that interpretation is offered in court cases, particularly in civil cases. And that was put into a bill. Bill 6362 will be making its rounds in the next legislative session, and it's currently being sponsored by Senator Hasagawa. So that's something to look out for, and I hope that, I think also the thing about early childhood, sometimes with all the work that you all do, sometimes it's hard to think outside of the classroom. And so much of our advocacy needs to be about changing systems that are not just in education because they have profound effects on all of us. And changing statutes around legislative interpretation might seem far removed from the classroom, but I think it speaks a lot for how we value multilingualism in our society and our culture. And that trickles down to early learning and how funding is distributed to multilingual learners in K-12 and in pre-K early childhood settings. So all of it has impact. Um, and really, what I hope with all of our expertise in this area too is to build an anti-racist early childhood system that advocates against oppression, racism, xenophobia, and all forms of discrimination. And so when we see it, we should speak up and do the work so that it is not what we are handing down to the next generation and the generation after that, even though we know systems are going to perpetuate and 100 years later we're probably still advocating for justice, and yet our work does have impact and does have consequence. And I think part of that is holding on to this really fierce hope that things can change and will change, particularly with our actions and the actions of our children and families and communities and neighbors. So on that note, I just really thank you all for being here and for, leaning into this work, which can be really difficult and often disheartening too, to see what's going on in this world and how it's affecting children, through violence and war and all other means. So I really appreciate you all taking that time to participate in this session and grapple with these questions. I'm also just gonna put a link to a GoFundMe page for Zen and her ongoing struggles, so you can read about it, and feel free to share with other folks if they have the capacity to support her.
Jamie, thank you so much for this powerful and amazing training. This was very inspiring. Thank you for being such an incredible advocate and co-conspirator for Zen in this real life situation, and for so bravely sharing this story and finding ways to connect it back to our work with children. And really, how do we start at the beginning so that this doesn't happen again, so that we can interrupt that hurt? And what I'm really taking away is this idea of helping children see themselves as co-conspirators. That is such a fantastic word. And I'm already imagining 3 and 4-year-old trying to say that, say that big word, and it makes me smile. Um, yeah, just thank you for motivating us and inspiring us to really continue to do this every day and bring that nuance to that anti-bias, anti-racist education that we're all striving to do. So thank you so much. There's appreciations coming through for you in the chat. Thank you so much to all of you for participating, showing up on a sunny Thursday night to do this important work. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Feel free to come off mute on your way out.